Well, this is Sky News in just a moment, the press preview. A first look at what is on the front pages. First, though, this evening, our top stories. Sky sources say the Japanese car maker Nissan is to abandon plans to build its X-Trail model at its plant in Sunderland. A local MP has described the news as deeply troubling. The Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro has called for early parliamentary elections as thousands of people take to the streets for further protests against the government. And heavy snowfall has left motorists stranded as severe wintry conditions threaten fresh travel disruption over the weekend. Well, hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages as they come in. In the next half hour or so then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalists Rachel Shabby and Benedict Spence. Very good evening to both of you, good to see you. So as ever, the front pages, let's start with The Observer. It says rebel Labour MPs are preparing to quit the party and form a new centre group over what's described as growing discontent with the way that Jeremy Corbyn is running the party. Writing in the Sunday Telegraph, Theresa May appeals to Jeremy Corbyn for support to insist the EU must offer concessions on her Brexit deal. The Sunday Times writes that the Queen and other senior royals will be evacuated from London in the event of riots triggered by a no-deal Brexit. The Daily Mirror reports that Boris Johnson threw away 70 pages of potentially sensitive political documents at a petrol station. The Daily Mail carries allegations concerning expenses paid to the Conservative peer, John Selwyn Gummer, although he vehemently denies any wrongdoing. The Express leads with what it calls begging by the BBC to try to get support for a plan to scrap free TV licences for people over the age of 75. While The Star has a story about former footballer Ryan Giggs and a family rift with his brother. So, Rachel, Benedict are here. Let's plunge straight into the Sunday Times, shall we? The great evacuation plan, for who?
Well, this is supposedly old Cold War plans for the evacuation of the royal family, originally set up in the event of a nuclear strike by the Soviet Union. We now have our own nuclear strike, which will be a no-deal Brexit. And on the off chance that the people of London start rioting, this is the Times story, that they will be evacuated to a secret location and kept safe. Now, I don't want to go down the route of straight off the bat going, this is a scare story, but on the one hand, I'd say it's probably not unusual to have evacuation plans for members of the royal family in the event of national disasters. But I actually don't think that this is the most important story on the front page of the Times. Obviously, they've gone with it because it's quite sensationalist, but in the subheading, there's the story about Nissan, which was mentioned at the top of the programme, deciding to pull production of their new car at their plant in Sunderland. And I think that's a far more interesting story and a far more significant story, because one can look at it through the prism of a potential no-deal Brexit, that potentially being very damaging for companies like Nissan. But one also has to look at this slightly more broadly. Italy has just entered a recession. Germany and France are both on the brink of one. The Chinese economy has ground to a halt, which has seen lots of car companies struggling. It's not just in the UK, it's across the world at the moment. So we shouldn't just look at this entirely through the prism of Brexit. One also has to remember the UK remains one of the most prosperous countries in the whole of the European Union in terms of investment. I mean, where I live, just down the road from me in Norfolk, the local factory, the Bookprint Works, which is the largest in Europe, has just been bought by an Italian company. So they clearly don't think that that's going to go under anytime soon. There are still markets to be tapped, even in the event of a no-deal Brexit. The important thing right now is that none of us know how it's going to end. And I think it would be unwise to just look at this purely through the prism of a no-deal Brexit.
You didn't even mention people are veering away from diesel cars as well, which is another explanation. Nonetheless, the government seemed to be in talks with Nissan in the months after the referendum, seemed to be offering undisclosed sweeteners and promises. So in some senses, this still feels like bad news for the government, doesn't it?
It's bad news for people in Sunderland. I mean, I was wondering how people who support Brexit would spin this. When I heard the news about Nissan cancellation shock for Sunderland, which is the Times subheading, I was thinking, how are Leave campaigners going to massage this into making it look like it's not about Brexit? Look, the company before Brexit said that were Brexit to happen, they would have to reconsider their investments in this plant. 6,700 people are employed at that plant. It produces 2,000 cars a day, 6,700 people. How many households is that? How many families is that? How many children is that? And we're going to pretend that it's not about Brexit and that it doesn't matter?
They're not closing the factory,
They're
though,
not
are they?
closing it.
They're
but
just
they're
not making that model there, and we don't know actually what model this is going to be aimed at, which market is this going to be aimed at.
Look, if a company has stopped investing, if it stopped investing in future growth, you need to start worrying. By definition, you need to start worrying about the future of that company. I'm not saying we shouldn't have to worry about the future. I don't even know what to say anymore. I don't even know what to say anymore when we're absorbing all this horrible news. Businesses, day after day, are telling us that they're contracting, they're laying off, they're moving, and it doesn't seem to make any difference. It doesn't seem to have any impact on your desire to push ahead with this plan. That is going to make people lose jobs.
I'm not saying it has nothing to do with Brexit, but what I am saying is if we look at this in the broader context of the global economy, there are no car manufacturers that are doing especially well as a result of this. That's the nature of a global slowdown in the financial markets.
OK, well, it was a story brought to us by our city editor, Mark Kleinman. The announcement we will see on Monday. We'll see what else might be built there or continue to be built there. Hopefully, we'll find out more from Nissan. Should we move on to the Sunday Telegraph, where Theresa May has been speaking, making a plea perhaps to Jeremy Corbyn to speak with one voice, as she says she will take the battle of Britain back to Brussels.
Yeah, she's going back to Brussels to ask them to do the thing that they have said repeatedly they cannot do, and which she, a few weeks ago, had told the entire country was not possible to do. So this is a pretty futile exercise. There is no indication that the EU would move away from that insistence on the backstop. It's there for a very good reason. And that there is no convincing explanation for why any of that should change. So I don't quite know what this is an exercise in, except delaying the inevitable, which is she will come back with the same deal and Parliament will reject it.
Frankly, I agree. I think that the timeline actually makes this pretty much useless, pretty futile. If we were talking about this maybe 6 months down the line, when there might have been some sort of upset in the European Parliament, what with the way that those elections look like they might be going, well, then maybe she might have been able to get some leeway. But right now, the EU doesn't actually have to budge on any of these things right now. So I don't think that they will. And ultimately, we're forgetting that even if she were to get a deal and bring it back to Parliament, Parliament then again has to have the meaningful vote, which right now it looks like she doesn't have the numbers for, even if they were able to do something on the Irish backstop. There's no confirmation that all of those MPs who said that they'd reconsider it actually would vote for it. And then, of course, we have the exiting the European Union bill, which hasn't even been published yet, and then has to be put through Parliament as well. So we're no closer to actually having a deal of any sort. And how many days are we away from?
54 days.
54. This has been so well planned.
But amongst those nations most damaged by no deal is obviously Ireland, which seems to be the pressure. Should Ireland unilaterally act and make it easier? Theresa May going, the paper tells us, to seek either an alternative to the backstop, we've heard that before, or a time limit, or a unilateral mechanism to opt out, effectively, all, as you said, already rejected by Brussels. So is the alternative really Jeremy Corbyn? The paper telling us that she believes, that he said to her, he believes the backstop needs to be addressed with Brussels as well. Is that a glimmer of hope, do you think, that there might be some unity between the two main parties?
Yeah, I don't really understand what that was about coming from Corbyn, because, as I understand it, maybe I've got this wrong, but I thought that the Labour Party supported, a customs union, in which case there is no need for the backstop. So I don't really particularly get that line. But I also am really disturbed by this suggestion that Ireland should change its position. Why on earth should it change its position? You know, there is a very good reason why Ireland fears the possibility of a hard border on the island of Ireland. So, the suggestion now that somehow this is the EU's fault and it's Ireland's fault is just preposterous. Nobody is to blame apart from leavers who did not consider any of this when they
She's going to look at you again.
Of course she is. That's what I'm here for.
But why? How? Yeah, it's a mystery.
With my legislation, with my legislative programme, that
Do you not have one?
All I will,
thought you had
sadly
one.
not. No. Well, I didn't have to think of one. I haven't stood for election. Nobody will elect me.
Well, you can know that. They might.
Oh, I know that. I have to live with me. What I would say is I actually agree in many ways. It is in Ireland's interests to do what Ireland needs to do. We shouldn't be putting any blame on the Irish government. They are elected by the Irish people, and they have to respect the wishes of them in the same way that our government needs to respect the wishes of people who voted to leave.
So do you see a situation where people who want leave would countenance the idea of a customs union for this problem to go away?
Well, I think when we say a customs union, we have to think very carefully about specifically what would be involved in that. Would it be some sort of bespoke arrangement? Because as far as I'm aware, the European Union isn't interested in that. So whether or not...
Well, they've offered a UK-wide one, as part of a means of getting around this problem, haven't
Yes, but
they?
for how long? That's the key thing there. How long does this last for?
Well, it lasts as long as, Leavers insist that there's no need for a backstop because there is some magic way of getting around it. If they're that confident in there being a way around it, why don't they accept the backstop?
I simply think that they won't accept it because they see it as a means of keeping the UK within the clutches of the European Union, and they want a timeline on that. And yes, well, it's
terrible clutches the EU has.
Oh, it's just a figure.
I feel them every day.
Do you?
Yeah.
Let's go to the Observer while we're talking about splits in parties and things like that. Rebel Labour MPs set to quit the party and form a centre group. I mean, some people have been agitating this for a while, haven't they?
Yeah, there's been rumours about this for a while, and now the Observer has apparently been told by multiple sources that at least 6 MPs have decided to resign the whip and leave the party, and also they're talking about a bigger split at some point after Brexit. Now, as you say, that's been in the sort of air supply for a while, but in fairness, it's not just these MPs who are discontent with the way things are going with the Labour Party and Brexit. Certainly, there is displeasure amid the Labour movement and the grassroots and the party membership, which, of course, does want Labour to, at some point, support a second referendum. That was what the Labour conference policy agreement was. And the party has made clear that it is a party of democracy. Jeremy Corbyn's main platform, a major platform, was that he wanted to democratise the party. He wanted to encourage participation, and that is indeed why so many people joined. So, of course, there is displeasure now to see the party leadership apparently not follow that policy of supporting a second referendum. And at the same time, there is apparently, according to this Observer piece, there is discontent from the unions at the sight of Len McCluskey, who's been holding talks with Theresa May. And the Observer is quoting some union sources saying that they just don't like the optics of it. It looks like perhaps an attempt to bypass trade union policy and Labour Party policy. So there's a lot of different strands of annoyance that goes beyond, actually, these 6 MPs.
God forbid people try to get out of the clutches of the unions. I think it's
One thing
that I do think is worth mentioning, though, is that we look at the MPs in question, the constituencies that they're from. The one that stands out straight away for me is Luciana Berger in Liverpool Wavertree. Now, Liverpool Wavertree, Liverpool as a city, is very staunchly territorially aligned with the Labour Party. So I think a lot of these MPs, if they are really thinking about splitting from the Labour Party, they do have to think actually about how people are going to vote alongside party lines that have been in the DNA of their communities for a very long time. We saw at the last general election, for all the confidence of the Conservatives that they were going to wipe out Labour, actually old habits die hard and people stick to what they know. So I don't necessarily think that this is going to be a particularly fruitful enterprise.
Yes, perhaps we can do that story again at 11:30 and talk more about the names. It's fascinating anyway, but we are running late. I'm always like that. Next up, you've heard of Mind the Gap. Now it's Mind the Snowdrops. Tread softly. You could be treading on a fortune. Explaining that after this break.
It's a deliberate ploy.
That's interesting. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Rachel Shabby and Benedict Spence. Welcome back to both of you. Front page of the Sunday Times, concern we've had about suicide rates and also about self-harm. How does this story tie in?
I mean, well, for a start, we look at the left, this isn't necessarily tied in, but it's an interesting sort of comparison with that story. This is an example of a project that's been done where photographs of teenage girls have been taken and then they've been allowed to alter those photographs to make themselves look better. And the ones on the right are what they think they would like to look like, as it were. They'd like to post of themselves. And I think it's quite an interesting insight into the minds of lots of young people today, because it's quite shocking just how much of a change they feel they need to go through, how aggressive the change is in many ways.
And how gorgeous they are anyway.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
The lack of perception, really, of their own reality and how they feel they ought to look. And you just think, well, of course, things like social media are going to be driving people's poor mental health if it's this sort of culture that encourages you almost having to change yourself, which in some ways might be seen as a form of self-mutilation, obviously not on the self, but of your image. Which is interesting because, of course, we've had in the last few weeks talks about internet chat rooms and lots of harmful content with teenagers egging each other on to self-harm and to hurt themselves. And it seems to just be part of an online culture that is self-perpetuating in many ways. And I just think it's an incredibly sad story as much as anything else. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like
This
to
is
be in that position.
this is a project by the British photographer Rankin, and the photos on the right are the ones at which point these young women felt their images were worthy of being posted to social media. So that's why it's so alarming that that's what they feel is worthy of being shared. And it must be a huge pressure, if that's how people are feeling about their appearance and their need to present a particular image of themselves to the public on social media. It must be such an overwhelming pressure. And of course, it's such a distortion. So it's no wonder that people are feeling so anxious, and it is affecting their mental health.
I'm going to show you the last story. I haven't got time to talk about it. We'll do it at 11:30, having watched my children jump on my snowdrops all day. It looks like a very important story. Mind that snowdrop. It could net you £725. Well, hello there. You're watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. In the next half hour, then, we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist Rachel Shabby and the writer and journalist Benedict Spence. Is that about right?
More or less.
Okay.
I can write.
You can write. That's good.
It helps.
And speak, which is even better for us. To the front pages, let's take a look, shall we? To start with The Observer. It says that rebel Labour MPs are preparing to quit the party and form a new centre group over what is described as growing discontent with the way that Jeremy Corbyn is running the party. Writing in the Sunday Telegraph, Theresa May appeals to Jeremy Corbyn for support to insist the EU must offer concessions on her Brexit deal. The Sunday Times writes that the Queen and other senior royals will be evacuated from London in the event of riots triggered by a no-deal Brexit. The Daily Mirror reports that Boris Johnson threw away 70 pages of potentially sensitive political documents at a petrol station. Excuse me. The Daily Mail carries allegations concerning expenses paid to the Conservative peer John Selwyn Gummer, although he vehemently denies any wrongdoing. The Express leads with what it calls begging by the BBC to try to get support for a plan to scrap free TV licences for people over the age of 75. While the Star has a story about former footballer Ryan Giggs and a family rift with his brother. So Rachel Shabby, Benedict Spence are here to take us through their picks, and you've started with the Sunday Times, a Brexit plan to evacuate the Queen, or her from a building, one hopes. Not quite right, is it? But what's the story here?
Well, I was going to say, an eagle-eyed person in the studio has spotted an error, so please don't tweet in if you can see the error at home. Essentially, the story is that there is a plan in place to move the royal family in case riots break out in the event of a no deal. And then it's got another story, which is that Nissan has decided not to produce a certain type of car at its Sunderland plant. Now, we'll start off with the story about Her Majesty. It would be very negligent if there wasn't a plan to move the royal family to safety in the events that riots, for any reason, broke out. So I don't think we need to, go too far into this. Now, the second story, of course, is the slightly more interesting one, the one about Nissan cancelling production of its new car in its Sunderland plant. The key thing to bear in mind about this is that the car in question is a £30,000 SUV that is run on diesel. Diesel cars are not selling across the world. They've gone down in sales by almost 5% in the last year. They're estimated to make up less than 5% of the global total of automobiles in the next 10 years. Why? Because of the huge amount of taxes that are being levied on diesel cars, because they're simply not as green or efficient as people thought they were. Also, bear in mind, as we're in the midst of a global slowdown, a £30,000 SUV is not necessarily the first thing that people are going to start buying. We've already seen Jaguar Land Rover begin to pull production elsewhere. We're seeing it in Italy, we're seeing it in Germany. In those countries that have already gone into recession, car manufacturers there are slowing production. Cars in general aren't selling, especially diesel cars. So I don't necessarily think that this has that much to do with Brexit. Of course, they're going to say it has to do with Brexit. All the companies are, because they, as businesses, don't want to have to pay tariffs in any eventuality. So it makes business sense to say that. But it is also worth bearing in mind, they haven't said that they're going to be closing the factory. No jobs appear to be being lost. They also haven't said that they're going to be building it anywhere else, which rather suggests that they've just shelved the idea because it's not profitable.
Well, they haven't said anything yet. This was a story that our city editor, Mark Kleinman, managed to get. The announcement, he understands, is on Monday.
Yeah.
So we wait all of those details. But, do you think this is about Brexit, Rachel?
So you're right that they haven't confirmed it. The company did say before Brexit that of course it would have an impact. That, this is a company that is based in Sunderland. Nissan is based in Sunderland because the UK is a gateway to the EU, which is a huge market for its cars, 2,000 of which are made every day in Sunderland, which it's an incredible amount of cars. Just under 6,000 people are employed there. Now, it's interesting to me the contortions people make to make it seem as though none of this is to do with Brexit. OK, you're right. This is not to do with Brexit. Jaguar and Ford leaving is not to do with Brexit. Sony, Dixon's, Bentley, Airbus, Panasonic, another list of companies that I could mention. Nothing to do with Brexit. It's just a weird coincidence. And, I've run out of things to say about this because obviously it doesn't make any difference. People who want to leave still want to leave, and people who campaigned for it insist that it is completely irrelevant. So all I can say is that I feel bad for people in Sunderland, for the 6,700 people who work at that plant and who are now dealing with uncertainty. I'm sorry about that. I feel bad about it.
Well, I feel bad that you think that there's some sort of mystery around this. As I've explained, the product isn't sellable, it's not profitable, so they're not going to make it. They haven't said that they're closing the factory.
You're right. It's
they're
just
not
a
going to stop
coincidence
making any
that
of these other
businesses are
cars.
leaving the
Well,
UK.
no, it isn't a coincidence,
It really
because
is
actually
just
it's not a coincidence to do with the manufacture
Brexit.
of diesel cars, because nobody's buying diesel cars,
Okay.
regardless of Brexit. It's not happening anywhere
You're
else.
right. None of this has anything to do with Brexit.
Meanwhile, whether this is a blow to Number 10 or not, we will wait to see. They are, the Daily Mail tells us, or the Mail on Sunday tells us, apologies, preparing for an election and, in fact, have penciled in June the 6th. Yes,
Throwing
lost your
papers
lid.
at you.
June the 6th, then.
Yes, I mean, the timeline for me doesn't make a great deal of sense there, because June the 6th is, of course, after we're supposed to have left the European Union. So what is that? Is that because they're anticipating some sort of extension to the process, because they don't have the numbers to get the deal through the Commons at the moment? Possibly. I can't imagine it's because they think they're going to get a fantastic deal, or that in the event of a hard Brexit, people are going to be really keen to vote for them. So that's what I imagine is probably on the cards there, is that they think that they're going to have to try to extend Article 50. And then when it is clear that they can't get whatever deal Theresa May comes back with through the Commons as last time, they will then go to the country and say, look, it is either this or hard Brexit. You have to vote for us. I don't think it'll work, because I just don't think people trust the Conservatives. I think they've possibly fallen for a lot of the polling that we are seeing at the moment, which puts them on quite a large lead ahead of Labour, as they did last time, and look what happened. So, we wait and see. That's what I expect is going to happen. I could be wrong.
This article suggests that Number 10 strategists have discussed a scenario under which the Prime Minister would delay the Article 50 agreement, as you said, and they would delay it beyond the end of March with the Commons' support for her deal in April, and then go to the country in the following weeks on the back of her success. So slightly different from what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. So they think that they can, electorally gain from what they're describing as a Brexit honeymoon. So once she gets the deal, everybody will think she's amazing, and then we'll vote her in again for another 5 years. And in fairness, she was asked, I think, a couple of weeks ago whether there should be another general election. She said no. And then at that point, everyone said, oh, well, we're having one then, because of, 2017, when she kept saying, no, we're not having one, and then we had one. So, it's hard to say what really is going on. But this is coming as the Tory party is reported to have moved on to this kind of war footing. It's block booking, printing plants and hiking its spend on advertising. At one point, the party chief was saying, well, that's because we want to promote our flagship NHS amazing policy. But now people are starting to wonder whether actually that's block booking ahead of a potential election.
I mean, they could just be stockpiling in the event of a no deal. We don't actually know yet.
Because that's the thing we're going to need, is more advertising.
Oh, dear.
Medicines, food.
I'm sorry, they're politicians. Of course they want to stockpile on these sorts of things. I'm being mean.
You are. You're being, yes. The opinion poll is in The Observer. Tories on 41%, Labour on 34%. Meanwhile, Theresa May has been writing in the Sunday Telegraph. She promises to battle for Britain when she travels to Brussels, and also suggests that Jeremy Corbyn also believes that Brussels needs to look at the backstop. So this story on the front page of The Observer is addressing that, amongst other things. So it's reporting that over Jeremy Corbyn's policy around Brexit and, the kind of negotiations that are taking place now, some rebel MPs are saying that they want to quit the party, resign the whip, and then formulate a sort of centre party after Brexit. Now, in fairness, rebel Labour MPs set to quit party is quite a regular story that we've seen over the last couple of years. It seems quite evergreen. But there is a wider story reported here in The Observer, which is to do with growing discontent amongst the membership and amongst the grassroots and amongst the Labour movement. And that's to do with the perception that the leadership is not in alignment with the membership. And don't forget, Jeremy Corbyn, one of his big calling cards is that he is in alignment with the membership, that he does want to listen, that he does want people to participate, and that the party is the democratic. So are there two issues then, therefore, for him? One is, does he actually support a second referendum or a people's vote? And the other one is, if there was a general election called, we've already seen the Mail article, would they go into that being a party of Brexit? And has that been the problem for some in the membership?
So I think for the membership, the problem is that, a Labour Party policy was agreed at conference around Brexit, and it was a very big deal. 150 different constituency Labour parties came together, hashed out a deal, quite an achievement, by which, a second vote would be one of the options that's on the table, as well as a general election potentially. So I think the problem arises when there is a perception of a divergence from that. So it's not necessarily about, what happens when there's an election. It's more about, is this party going to be one that does listen to its members? Because that's why we're so enthused about the leadership, or it's one of the reasons, or isn't it? And if it isn't, then just be honest and say that. So I think that's where the discontent is coming. In the event of an election, I think, some of the ideas are circulating are, well, perhaps Labour would say, we're going to try and negotiate a deal, but we would put that to a referendum. So we would get a better deal, but then we would put that to the vote.
I mean, from my perspective, I just think it's very interesting. As you say, every single week we seem to have some sort of story about a new centrist party emerging. I simply doubt whether or not such a party would be able to break the traditional tribal lines, especially in Labour communities that have existed for generations, but also in Conservative circles as well. Frankly,
to some on the left, Tony Blair was a centrist party or led a centrist Labour Party.
True, but that was a slight anomaly to this. I don't think that an entirely new party is just going to be able to waltz into, for example, Luciana Berger's Liverpool Wavertree constituency and be able to win that. I just don't see that happening, and I think that's probably the case for an awful lot of constituencies. I do think that ultimately Brexit is going to cost a lot of these MPs their positions, you know, especially the pro-Remain MPs who find themselves in constituencies that voted Leave. So how it is that people like that square that circle, I'm not quite sure.
OK, it's fascinating, isn't it? What's going to happen to politics? It is thrown up, it lands, we'll see where. Coming up, though, mind that snowdrop. It could be worth a small fortune. All will be explained, we hope, after the break. So it should all be regulated more, shouldn't it? Yeah. Clear my throat quickly now.
Same.
So it's two stories, really, isn't it? That all speak of the same problem, really, yeah?
Totally.
Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview with me this evening, Rachel Shelby and Benedict Spence. Welcome back to both of you. Let's go to the Sunday Times, shall we? Two stories on the front page here, which both speak of the same problem, which is, I suppose, teen anxiety, young people's anxiety in many respects.
Yeah, so we have this is a project by the British photographer Rankin, and he took pictures of teenagers and asked them to edit the pictures until they felt the pictures were worthy of being uploaded onto social media sites such as Instagram. So the left-hand side is the unaltered pictures, and it's just really sad. It's awful to think. There's obviously nothing wrong with the pictures on the left, but it speaks volumes to a sort of distortion that people feel like that's what they need to look like before they can share those images onto social media. And that is obviously not the only element, but it is a consideration. He's called this the selfie harm. And, you know, this article here that's talking about suicidal generation, where the number of teenage suicides has doubled nearly in around 8 years. And so there's a huge alarm around young people, children aged 15 to 19. The rate of suicide amongst that generation has climbed, whereas in any other demographics, it's actually gone down, which is terrific and I suppose speaks to a growing awareness around mental health issues. But this particular generation, there's also a reliance on self-harm, apparently, as a way of coping, and self-harm is seen as one of the risk factors for suicide. So altogether, it just paints a really worrying picture.
But how much can you level, or how much of the blame for that can you level at social media?
Exactly.
Because you were saying earlier that actually the need for likes actually has a chemical impact on your brain.
There was a very interesting book that I read a few months back by Lee Daniel Kravitz called Strange Contagion, and in that book it talked about the phenomenon of mental illness and the effects of that, you know, things like suicide and self-harm. And the way it described it, it was thinking about it almost in terms of a pathogen that could be passed like a virus, because human behaviour, you know, human beings mirror each other's behaviours. You know, it's part of social conditioning, and the more that negative, you know, emotions and things spread, the more that is reflected more in society, and people mixing with each other become more vulnerable to it. Social media, as it were, is just that on steroids. It's just, you know, an incredibly easy way of spreading potentially quite damaging behaviours or trends. And we had the case of the poor girl who died a few weeks ago, and the suggestion was that she'd been in online chat rooms and on Instagram and things like that, where they'd been promoting these things and promoting self-harming, almost sort of one-upmanship. So it's not difficult to see how it can have a very negative effect, how it can really accelerate mental health issues, especially as, if we're talking about here, there's an idea of a sort of an artistic ideal that is impossible to achieve, and people feel the need to so drastically change everything about themselves, how they look, to try to meet those standards. That's only ever going to encourage real misery in a lot of people, I think.
Let's take a look at a final story, shall we, which is the little snowdrops, which are bursting their way through literally the snow at the moment. And actually, the rarer form of them are extremely valuable.
Supposedly this is because these snowdrops are, although they are very rare, they're genetically very strong, they're quite hardy, so they can survive in lots of different environments. They look unusual. And there is a big explosion for horticulture, especially amongst young people at the moment. I mean, you might not know this, but there's a company in London called Patch, where you can just you know, type in whatever plant it is that you want, and they'll deliver it to you on that day, just straight to your door. It's an incredibly easy way. You don't have to go to the garden centre or grow things from seeds anymore. There's a big sort of, you know, passion about filling your home with sort of lots of green things as a sort of a health, you know, sort of a wellness sort of thing. So in many ways, I'm not surprised that as this craze has sort of taken off and lots more people are getting really engaged and having lots of plants, that plants, much like sneakers, much like all kinds of things, can actually reach quite astronomical sums of money because they're rare.
£725 for a snowdrop is pushing it a bit,
I mean, I wouldn't
isn't it?
pay that for a
Despite the
snowdrop,
fad
yeah.
of...
Just stepping on that, though.
Yes, I know.
I've really annoyed.
I've been shouting at my children all day to get off our snowdrops, but they're not worth that much, I'm sure, certainly. Thank you both very much indeed. We will take a look at the weather, of course. Cold, we know. Rachel Shabby, Benedict Spence, thank you.